The persecution of pagans in the late Roman Empire began late during the reign of Constantine the Great, when he ordered the pillaging and the tearing down of some temples. The first anti-pagan laws by the Christian state started with Constantine's son Constantius II, who was an unwavering opponent of paganism. He ordered the closing of all pagan temples, forbade pagan sacrifices under pain of death, and removed the traditional altar of victory from the Senate. Under his reign, ordinary Christians started vandalizing many of the ancient pagan temples, tombs and monuments. This persecution had proceeded after a period of sporadic persecution of Christians. From 361 till 375, paganism was relatively tolerated, until three emperors, Gratian, Valentinian II and Theodosius I, under Bishop of Milan St. Ambrose's influence, reinstituted and escalated the persecution. Under pressure from the zealous Ambrose, Theodosius issued the infamous 391 Theodosian decrees, a declaration of war on paganism. The altar of victory was removed again by Gratian, the Vestal Virgins were disbanded, and access to pagan temples was prohibited. Anti-paganism policy of Constantine I. The anti-paganism policy of Constantine the Great evolved from the initial prohibition on the construction of new temples and the toleration of pagan sacrifices, to orders for the looting and the tearing down of the temples by the end of his reign. Earlier in his reign he had prohibited the construction of new temples but tolerated the practice of pagan sacrifices. According to church historians writing after his death, Constantine converted to Christianity and was baptized on his deathbed, thus making him the first Christian emperor. Constantine was baptized by Pope Sylvester I. Ban on new temples, toleration of sacrifices. Constantine, though he made his allegiance clear, did not outlaw paganism. In the words of an early edict, he decreed that polytheists could celebrate the rites of an outmoded illusion, so long as they did not force Christians to join them. In a letter to the king of Persia, Constantine wrote how he shunned the abominable blood and hateful odors of pagan sacrifices, and instead worshipped the high god on bended knee, and in the new capital city he built, Constantine made sure that there were no pagan temples built. Constantine would sporadically prohibit public sacrifice and close pagan temples. Very little pressure, however, was put on individual pagans, and there were no pagan martyrs. When Constantine dedicated Constantinople, two Neoplatonists' friends, Sopater and Praetextus, were present. A year and a half later, on Monday the 11th of May 330, when the festival of St. Mosius was celebrated, the city was finally dedicated. The goddess Tyche was invited to come and live in the city, and her statue was placed in the hand of the statue of the emperor that was on top of the column of Constantine, on the forum with the same name. Although by now Constantine openly supported Christianity, the city still offered room to pagan cults. There were shrines for the Dioscurian Tyche. The Acropolis, with its ancient pagan temples, was left as it was. As for worshipping the emperor, Constantine's mausoleum gave him a Christ-like status. His tomb was set amid 12 monuments, each containing relics of one of the apostles. Constantine had continued to engage in pagan rituals. The emperor still claimed to be a supernatural being, although the outward form of this personality cult had become Christian. According to some authors, the issuing of the Edict of Milan showed that Constantine continued the policy of toleration that Galerius had established. He continued to pay his public honors to the sun, until 325, on coins that showed him jointly with Sol Invictus, whereas his later coins showed the Chi-Rho sign. In that year he had the Christian bishops convene at the First Council of Nicaea, and from then on continued to take an active interest in the affairs of the Church. Many historians, including Macmillan, have seen the seeds of future persecution by the state in Constantine's more belligerent utterances regarding the old religion. Other historians emphasize that de facto paganism was tolerated in the period from Constantine to Gratian. Emperors were tolerant indeed, if not always in word. Church restrictions opposing the pillaging of pagan temples by Christians were in place even while the Christians were being persecuted by the pagans. Spanish bishops in AD 305 decreed that anyone who broke idols and was killed while doing so was not formally to be counted as a martyr, as the provocation was too blatant. Constantine became the first emperor in the Christian era to persecute specific groups of Christians, the Donatists. In order to enforce religious unity, Eusebius outlines various edicts in which Constantine expressed his lack of support and at times disgust for active sacrifice and idol worship. Eusebius tells us that while Constantine disposed their shires of falsehood, Constantine did not attempt to bring down any of the shrines or idols that populated various cities, including his new capital Constantinople. The historian T.D. Barnes makes multiple references to Eusebius's work by which Barnes attests that Constantine was heavily in favor of the banning of pagan worship, instead of taking down pagan worship sites. Constantine chose to instead ban the erecting of more sites as well as expanding and funding the creation of more churches. Lastly, in the text of Codex Theodosianus outlined in religious conflicts of 4th century Rome, it seems that Constantine outright bans the madness of sacrifice. Sacrifice is the cornerstone of the pagan religion and was necessary for worship. In this letter it is not clear whether it was issued by Constantine before or after his death, but it is addressed to his praetorian prefect. The problem with this interpretation of a more religiously zealous Constantine is the issue of his reign. Although Constantine is regarded as the first Christian emperor, this does not mean that there are no longer any pagans in the empire. The explosive growth of the Christian population and power base through the 2nd and 3rd century does indicate that Christians were now the dominant force of the empire. However, that does not mean that Christian held a numerical advantage or a sufficient power base on which to draw on to begin a systematic persecution of pagans. To start a persecution after only a few years on the throne among a population of only recently demoted pagans in the East did not make sense. In addition, there are various accounts that Constantine was still somewhat tolerant of the pagans. His earlier edict, the Edict of Milan, was changed to the Edict of the Provincials. The historian H. A. Drake points out that this edict, which called for peace and tolerance, let no one disturb another, let each man hold fast to that which his soil wishes. Constantine never reversed this edict, and Drake even goes as far as to believe Constantine may have been trying to create a society where the two religions merged peacefully. Regardless, there is also evidence that Constantine did in fact erect several pagan worship sites. With the pagan historian Zosimus, we see that Constantine erected several statues of Apollo as well as other pagan gods. While it is clear that Constantine removed many pagans from office and replaced him with Christians as well as removing the requirement of sacrifice for imperial offices, Constantine seemed to only care about spreading his religion, not abolishing all others. Legislation against magic and private divination. Constantine legislated against magic and private divination, but this may have been motivated by a fear that others might gain power through those means. Despite enacting such legislation, he also enacted contradictory legislation that called for the consultation of augurs after an amphitheatre had been struck by lightning in the year 320. Constantine explicitly allowed public divination as well as public pagan practices to continue. Constantine also issued laws confirming the rights of flamens, priests and duumvirs. In 321 he legislated that the venerable day of the sun should be a day of rest for all citizens. This ambiguous wording is capable of being interpreted as referring to the Christian day of rest or to the invincible sun. In the year 323, He issued a decree banning Christians from participating in state sacrifices, looting and destruction of temples. During the course of his life he progressively became more Christian and turned away from any syncretic tendencies he appeared to favor at times. Even if Constantine had desired to Christianize the state, expediency dictated otherwise, since Christians may have formed only a fifth part of the population in the west and a half of the population in the east. Constantine had a complex attitude towards morality. Both his son and wife were executed at his instigation, destroyed the temple of Aphrodite in the Lebanon, and ordered the execution of eunuch priests in Egypt because they transgressed his moral norms. According to the historian Ramsay MacMullen, Constantine desired to obliterate non-Christians, but lacking the means he had to be content with robbing their temples. Towards the end of his reign, he resorted to derogatory and contemptuous comments relating to the old religion, writing of the true obstinacy of the pagans, of their misguided rites and ceremonial, and of their temples of lying, contrasted with the splendors of the home of truth. The first episodes of persecution of paganism in the Christian history of the Roman Empire started late in Constantine's reign, with his orders for the pillaging and the tearing down of pagan temples. Anti-paganism policy of Constantius II. The anti-paganism policy of Constantius II lasted from 337 till 361. It was marked by laws and edicts that punished pagan practices. Laws dating from the 350s prescribed the death penalty for those who performed or attended pagan sacrifices, and for the worshipping of idols, temples were shut down, and the altar of victory was removed from the Senate meeting house. There were also frequent episodes of ordinary Christians destroying, pillaging, desecrating, vandalizing many of the ancient pagan temples, tombs and monuments. Paganism was still popular among the population at the time. The emperor's policies were passively resisted by many governors and magistrates. Initial measures. Constantius II's legislation began with the banning of the pagan practice of sacrifice. This was in keeping with his personal maxim was "Ses et superstitia, sacrificium amabilis insania." According to Libanius, Constantius was effectively under the control of others who inspired him to end pagan sacrifices. With the collapse of official government-sanctioned pagan rites, private cults attempted to infiltrate the temples. In the year 353, Constantius prohibited pagan sacrifice under the penalty of death. He also shut down some temples, forbade access to them, and ended their subsidies of public taxes. Consistent with Christian theology, Constantius carried out an active campaign against magicians, astrologers and other diviners. This may also be due to his becoming fearful that others might use these means to make someone else emperor. Herbermann contends that the anti-paganism legislation had an unfavorable influence on the Middle Ages and become the basis of the Inquisition. Relative moderation. The emperor never attempted to disband the various Roman priestly colleges or the Vestal Virgins. He never acted against the various pagan schools. He ordered the election of a priest for Africa. Also, he remained Pontifex Maximus until his death, and was deified by the Roman Senate after his death. The relative moderation of Constantius' actions toward paganism is reflected by the fact that it was not until over 20 years after Constantius' death, during the reign of Gratian, that any pagan senators protested their religion's treatment. Pagan resistance. The government's policies could not be rigidly executed due to the strength of paganism among the population. No matter what the imperial edicts declared in their fearful threats, the vast numbers of pagans, and the passive resistance of pagan governors and magistrates rendered them largely impotent in their application. However, the effects of policy were enough to contribute to a widespread trend towards Christian conversion, though not enough to make paganism extinct. Anti-pagan actions by ordinary Christians. Some Christians encouraged the emperor to take even more extreme measures in their zeal to stamp out paganism, e.g., in the aftermath of the abolition of sacrifices. Firmicus Maternus, a convert to Christianity, urged, "Paganism, most holy emperors, must be utterly destroyed and blotted out, and disciplined by the severest enactments of your edicts, lest the deadly delusion of the presumption continue to stain the Roman world, and, how fortunate you are that God, whose agents you are, has reserved for you the destruction of idolatry and the ruin of profane temples." Suzoman contends that Constantius did not, apparently, attempt to stop the Christians from destroying and pillaging many of the ancient temples. However, in the Theodosian Code there is a law for the preservation of the temples that were situated outside of city walls. Constantius enacted another law that exacted a fine from those who were guilty of vandalizing sites holy to pagans and placed the care of these monuments and tombs under the pagan priests. Magnentius rebelled against and killed Constans. Although he used Christian symbols on his coins, he revoked the anti-paganism legislation of Constans and even permitted the celebration of nocturnal sacrifices. 3 years later, in the year 353, Constantius defeated Magnentius and once again forbade the performance of the rituals. This law seems to have had little effect, as we find Constantius once again legislating against paganism in 356. Constantius now declared that anyone found guilty of attending sacrifices or of worshipping idols would be executed. It appears the magistrates were uncomfortable with carrying out this law. It was largely ignored. Removal of the altar of victory. In 357, Constantius removed the altar of victory in the Senate house because of the complaints of some Christian senators. This altar was later restored, either silently, soon after Constantius' departure, or by Emperor Julian the Apostate. Restoration and tolerance. From Julian until Valentinian I. Valens. Julian the Apostate attempted to revive paganism during his brief period of rule. Under equally brief reign of his successors, Jovian, Valens and Valentinian I, persecution of pagans was minimal. Under the sole rule of Julian, 361–363, Julian the Apostate was Roman co-emperor since 355, and ruled solely for 18 months 361–363. Julian was a nephew of Constantine and received a Christian training. After childhood, Julian was educated by Hellenists and was attracted to the teachings of Neoplatonists and the old religions. However, he witnessed the assassination of his father, brother and other family members by the guards of the imperial palace, rightly or wrongly. He blamed this brutal act on the Christian emperor Constantius. His antipathy to Christianity was deepened when Constantius executed Julian's only remaining brother in 354 AD. Julian's religious beliefs were syncretic and he was an initiate of at least 3 mystery religions. But Julian's religious open-mindedness did not extend to Christianity. Christianity was fundamentally incompatible with syncretic paganism. Upon becoming emperor, Julian attempted to restore the old Roman religion. He also introduced some reforms to that religion in the hope of making it the driving force behind the empire. Julian allowed religious freedom and avoided any form of actual compulsion. The Christian Suzoman acknowledges that Julian did not compel Christians to offer sacrifice, nor did he allow the people to commit any active injustice towards the Christians or insult them. However, no Christian was allowed to teach or study the ancient classical authors, let them keep to Matthew and Luke, thus ending any chance they had of a professional career. He did not believe Christians could honestly teach subjects replete with allusions to Greek deities whose existence they denied. The Jewish historian and theologian Jacob Neusner writes, "It was only after the near catastrophe of Julian's reversion to paganism that the Christian emperor systematically legislated against paganism so as to destroy it. In the 18 brief months that he ruled between 361 and 363, Julian did not persecute Christians, as a hostile tradition contends, but he did make clear that the partnership between Roman Christian bishops forged by Constantine and maintained, despite conflicts over goals, by his son Constantius II, was now at an end, replaced by a government that defined its interests and those of Christianity as antithetical, religious toleration under Jovian, Valentinian and Valens. After the death of Julian, Jovian seems to have instituted a policy of religious toleration which avoided the extremes of Constantius and Julian. Under Valentinian and Valens, religious toleration continued. Pagan writers praise both of these emperors for their liberal religious policies. Valentinian, who ruled in the West, seems to have only been a half-hearted Christian, as he avoided attending his inaugural ceremony by 24 hours in order to avoid an inauspicious day. Valentinian and Valens granted complete toleration for all cults at the beginning of their reign in 364. Valentinian even allowed the performance of nocturnal sacrifices, which had been previously prohibited due to the attempt of some people to practice unlawful divination under the cover of the night. After the proconsul of Greece appealed to him, Valentinian also confirmed the rights and privileges of the pagan priests and confirmed the right of pagans to be the exclusive caretakers of their temples. Valens, who ruled the East, was an Arian and was too engaged with fighting against the Orthodox Christians to bother much with pagans. In both West and East, severe laws were once again passed prohibiting private divination. Due to the overzealousness of the populace to stop harmful divination, the haruspices and augurs began to be afraid to show themselves in public. This led the emperors to formally authorize the practice of official and lawful divination by law in 371.